Thank you, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about risk management, something dear to all of our hearts at the moment, given the pandemic. This presentation will be posted so that you can look at it. It'll be posted later today or tomorrow, along with the recording of the video of the webinar. Before we get started, just a quick note about MASS. We are a group, Management Advisory Services. We're a group of about 60 volunteers. And what we do is provide free management consulting to not-for-profits, primarily in the GTA, but now that we're all working virtually, we've also are able to provide services further afield. There'll be information at the back of the presentation with our website and phone number and email address, so that if you wanted to talk to us about doing anything with your organization, you'll be able to do that. So today we're going to talk about risk management, which, as I said, is, enterprise risk management is a core function of governance. And when we think about it, risk management is something we all do, particularly now with COVID, but we all intuitively tend to do risk management. But today we're going to talk about how we do it in a very systematic, intentional way for organizations. One of the issues around risk management is that boards tend to see risk management in very piecemeal ways. They don't tend to see it holistically. And so we're going to talk about how you go about risk management in very intentional, systematic way. In addition to muting yourselves, I would ask all of you to turn your video off. I think that'll help the quality of the recording if you all shut your video off for now. You can see here that we have a number of learning objectives for this session. I'll go through this. We're going to spend most of our time in the how to analyze it, identify and monitor risks. And I'll stop periodically and check the chat box. So as we go along, type in whatever questions that come up, and periodically I'll stop and check to see what questions there are and deal with the questions. So we're going to do this in modules. We're going to spend most of our time on module 2 and 3. We're going to spend some time defining risk and risk management, and then really the process of risk management and how to pull it all together. And then lastly, we'll talk a bit about what's the role of the board and what's the role of the staff when it comes to risk management. Before we get into this, often people think of risk management as a chore, something you just got to do, but you don't see much benefit to it. And I'd just like to share an anecdote with you, and I don't remember who I heard this from. It was a fellow being interviewed at the time of the financial crisis in 2008. And they were talking about bank regulation and whether or not it had an impact on, the Canadian banks didn't melt down, the US banks did, kind of thing. And the question he asked is, why do cars have brakes? And it's very interesting. If you think about why do cars have brakes, the answers most people come up with is so you can slow down, so you can stop, for safety. But his answer was, if you think about it, the reason cars have brakes is so we can go fast. And I'd like you to try and think of risk management the same way. Risk management is about putting up the guardrails so your organization, if you do risk management well, your organization can be more effective, more innovative, it becomes more agile. So I'd like you to think of risk management as an enabler rather than just some, chore you have to go through. So let's talk about what is risk. At the top there, you've got a dictionary definition of risk. But really, it's a very simple concept. Risk is the possibility of something bad happening. And today, we're going to look at risk management from an organizational perspective. So what are some examples? Well, the big example in front of all of us right now is the pandemic. But there are lots of examples of kinds of organizational risks. You have failure, you have contracts, you have the risk that you won't meet the terms of a contract. You have the loss of a key person, for instance, if an ED leaves. You have potential risks around fire or theft. So we're going to talk a lot about examples of risk and how you mitigate risk. If I can just say, Diane, you might want to take your video off. So risk management has many stakeholders, which is another thing to think about, because if something bad happens in your organization, you need to think about the people that it could impact. So it might, have an impact on your organization from a revenue or legal perspective, but it could also impact clients, partners, donors, the public. So something bad that could happen could have an impact beyond just internally to the organization. So you also need to think about kind of who are the stakeholders in risk management. The other thing is that risk management is ongoing. It's not a one-time exercise. It is a core governance function from the board perspective, managing enterprise risk. It's an ongoing thing that you have to look at. It's a culture. There's a certain, different organizations have just different risk management cultures. Think of it as a lens that you put on your organization to think about, looking at your organization through a risk management lens. And it's a process. And we're going to talk a lot about the process today. So it is not a one-time exercise. It is not somebody else's issue. We'll talk about the fact that we all have a role to play here. And it's not a sometime thing. It's an ongoing process. And really, there are 4 steps to this process. And they're the same steps whether you're thinking about this from an organizational perspective, from a personal perspective, from a project perspective, from a program perspective. It's these same 4 steps that we need to go through. The first thing we need to do is identify the risk. Then we have to kind of analyze that risk, and then we have to make a decision about, are we going to take the risk? How are we going to manage the risk? And then on an ongoing basis, we need to monitor the risks. So I want to stop there. And Tarana, if you can launch poll number 1. And while you're all looking at poll number 1, I will see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions here in the chat room at the moment. There's poll number 1. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being excellent, how well do you think your organization manages risk? If you could all just take a minute and look at that. So that's pretty good. You all have a relatively good handle on it. Some of you are kind of in the middle. You're doing some of it, maybe aren't doing quite as well as you should. Hopefully you can learn some things today that will help you get a bit better at it. But that's good, thanks. That gives me an idea. So you can end that poll now. So most people were at 3 or 4. So let's go on, since I don't see any questions. I do see somebody asking about the slide deck. The slide deck will be shared after the presentation, along with this recording. It'll be posted on the OCASI Maximizing Governance website. So let's talk about step 1, which is how do you identify risks? And this can be, I'm finding in working with organizations, a little bit trickier than people might think at first sight. But the important thing is to organize your thoughts. It is useful to think in categories of risk. So what are the big buckets of risk in your organization? And we'll talk about some of those categories, but you would all have some kind of financial management risks. You would all have some kind likely of IT risks. They would be very different depending on your organization and what you do. You'd all have some compliance risks, but again, they might be very different. Depending on your organization, depending on the activities you undertake. So some, like, you would all have likely the risk that you operate outside of your bylaws, but other risks would be very dependent on the type of like an advocacy organization would have very different risks from a social services organization. The other thing to think about is that risks change over time, which is why it's important that the board looks at this as an ongoing process. The organization changes, the types of clients you're working with can change over time. The environment changes over time. The kinds of activities your organization undertakes changes over time, which changes the risks that you're dealing with and changes the risk profile of the organization. So it's important, it's helpful to think about risks in terms of big buckets of risk. And these are just some example categories. There's nothing magical about these. They're things that are fairly common to most organizations. So you would have a bucket of risks around financial risks. Some of you might have a bucket of risks around real property or premises. You probably all have some HR risks. You know, if I expand HR to include volunteers. So these are buckets that just help you organize your thoughts rather than kind of scattered thinking around what your risks might be. And it helps in terms of taking a very systematic approach to identifying the risks in the organization. So we're going to go through some of these buckets. We're going to talk about specific examples of risks that you might have in each of these. So let's talk first about compliance risk. So there are really two types of compliance risk. The first type is a failure to do something that you are required to do as an organization. So the failure to file reports on time. So the failure to comply with an external or internal requirement. The second type of compliance risk you have is that you do something that you are prohibited from doing, either externally by regulation or internally by your bylaws. So compliance risk can the source can be internal or external, and it can be a failure to comply or doing something that you are prohibited from doing. So if you think about it, if I look at legal risks, the failure to meet contract requirements, which might have legal and financial consequences for you. If you're a charity, you have the risk that you would operate outside of your charitable objects. A risk that you would fail to meet the charitable reporting requirements. You would all have a risk around constating documents. So constating documents, just a fancy term for your basic corporate documents. So whether it's certificate of incorporation or letters patent, your articles, your bylaws, those impose certain things you must do and certain things you must not do. So you have risks around not complying with your your constating documents. So the idea in risk management is that you manage the risk to avoid the consequences. But I find that very often when people are trying to identify risk, in fact, they're identifying consequences. So they will say the risk is loss of charitable status. Well, that's not actually the risk. That's a consequence of the risk of operating outside of your charitable objects, or the risk of not meeting your charitable reporting requirements. The consequence of that is the loss of charitable status, which if you have great reliance on donations, for instance, could lead to another consequence of a drop in revenue, et cetera. But it's important to think about, is what you're thinking a risk, or is it a consequence of some other risk? If we go and look at some examples, and these are big buckets of operational risks. So you would all have some risks around, for instance, IT. You could have a security breach. Now, the consequence of that would be very different depending on the type of organization you are, depending on the kinds of activities you undertake. So the consequence is very much dependent, and how big that risk is dependent on the kind of organization you are. You under an HR bucket, for instance, you could have the failure to comply with employment standards. With real property, you have risks of fire, risks of theft, things like that. One that I think organizations and boards need to think about is what I would call capacity risks. What I see is organizations having increasing capacity gaps, which result in the organization taking on risks that they may not be appropriately mitigating. And capacity risks for me are, the staff isn't really sufficiently trained to do what they're doing, or you have an ED that retires, and you haven't really got the skill sets that you need for the organization. So I think paying close attention to capacity gaps that you have in the organization is another bucket that would be useful to think about. Another bucket would be financial risks. You have the risk of funding cutbacks. You would all have some kind of financial management risks. But again, that depends on the kinds of financial transactions you have and those things. You all under investment might have the risk of market losses if you have, depending on how you invest reserve funds. And you might have a mismatch in timing around cash flow. So thinking through the financial risks in the organization would be another bucket to think about. I think I skipped one here. Reputational risks is another one to think about. Your organizational reputation is a valuable asset that needs to be protected, and you need to think about the risks you could be taking around your reputation. For instance, if you aren't performing well in the partnerships you're in, that could have a reputational risk for your organization, both with your funders, your clients, and other partners. So that's another bucket that you might think about. Now, these buckets that I did are just kind of generic buckets. It's really useful to think about your organization and what are the logical buckets to kind of organize the risks in your organization. What are the buckets that will help you make sure that you've kind of covered and have organized the risks in a way that kind of makes them easy to see and easier to understand. So there's nothing magical about these buckets. And then the last bucket is just what I would call external risks. These are things you have absolutely no control over. They're nonetheless risks. I mean, when I started doing this presentation around risk management a couple of years ago, when I talked about pandemic risk and everybody kind of glazed over, These are risks that are out there, you know, and we'll talk about kind of how you would deal with these from a risk management perspective, but it's important to just kind of be aware of them and acknowledge that those risks are out there. So the very first step in the organization in risk management is to make sure you understand what are the risks in the organization. So I'm just going to stop for a minute here. Can you put up the second poll, Tarana, while I look at the chat box to see if there are any questions here? So there's the poll. All risks are generated by the activities an organization undertakes, true or false? So we've only got 15 of them answered, but let's see how we do. Get a few more people there. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Oh, here we go. What matrix would you recommend nonprofits utilize to evaluate risk? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a risk management framework and a matrix for making decisions around risk as we go forward. So, Janet, I would just ask you to hold that question. And when we get to that section, if it hasn't answered it, then please let me know. So I would end this poll now. The answer is false. Risks can also come totally external to the organization, like a pandemic risk, like natural disasters. They pose a risk to the organization. They can also, in the sense of be imposed by external authority, not necessarily internally imposed. But it isn't entirely dependent on the activities of the organization. So let's go on to step 2. So step 2 is, now that I've identified the risks and I kind of have a good idea of what the risks are in the organization, now I need to kind of figure out what I think about those risks. I need to analyze those risks. And there are really 3 questions I need to answer. The first question is, what's the likelihood that this will ever happen? So that's an important thing to understand. Secondly, what's the consequence if it does happen? Like, do I understand the consequences if it happens? And then secondly, so if it happened and I had to put up with these consequences, really, how severe is that impact on the organization? So I need to answer these 3 questions in order to be able to make some decisions around how I manage risk. So we'll look at each of these and talk about how we make these decisions. So the first question is, what's the likelihood that it will happen, and how do I decide that? Now, I'm suggesting that you rate the likelihood high, medium, or low, which I think is very useful, not too complex, and it will be sufficient for most of you in terms of making decisions and managing risk. If you look at the literature, there's some very complex rating systems around likelihood and impact, and very complex ways in mathematics to kind of rank your risks. But I think if you rate each risk high, medium, or low, and in the end, it's a judgment call. And it's not going to be the same for every organization. So you would look at past experience, you'd look at trends, but importantly, you would look at what controls do you have in place that make this more likely or less likely to happen. In reality, as I say, it's a judgment call. It's kind of a consensus call. You talk to other people in the organization. You decide if it's high, medium, or low. But if I give you some examples here, think about financial fraud as a risk. Now, It depends, first of all, on the types of transactions that you have in the organization, the types of financial transactions. It depends on processes that you have in sight, in place. Do you have a strong financial management policy that says how you do these things, and is that policy followed? If you have those things in place, then the likelihood it's going to happen in your organization is lower than if it's an organization that has a lot of transactions that might lend themselves to fraud. It doesn't have strong financial management policy in place. It doesn't have strong financial oversight by the finance committee. Then in that organization, there might be a higher likelihood of fraud. So it really is very particular to your organization and what controls you already have in place around that particular risk. Let's take the example that you operate outside your bylaws. Now you all have that risk, but if I'm in an organization where I have a governance committee where board members are familiar with the bylaws, where I have a governance committee or a board secretary or someone who kind of monitors that, makes sure we're operating as a board and as an organization in accordance with our bylaws, my risk of that is going to be much lower than if I'm in an organization where nobody's read the bylaws in the last 3 years, and probably couldn't tell me in some cases how, what their bylaws allow and don't allow. So it's very much a judgment call, this likelihood that it would happen, and depends on how you're currently kind of monitoring that risk. So the second thing you have to do is decide what are the consequences if that risk were to happen. And you have to be as specific as you can. So what would be the impact? So the consequence might be loss of funds, might be a potential legal liability. It might be harm to clients or staff. It could be a loss of data, but being specific about the consequences helps me judge whether or not, A, I want to take the risk, and B, whether or not I'm managing the risk appropriately. If I think about it, if the risk is I operate outside of my charitable status, the consequence is I could lose my charitable status. If I'm dependent on donations, I could see a significant loss of revenue. If I fail to comply with health and safety standards, the consequences could be harm to clients or staff. It could open me to legal liability and financial loss. So it's the second question around what's the consequence if it does happen. It helps to think through what would the consequence be, because I need to understand that in order to understand how to manage the risk. The third question that you need to ask is, how severe is the impact? So if the risk happens, these are the consequences. How severe would that be? And again, I would rate these high, medium, or low. And again, it's a judgment call. It's probably some discussion within the organization. It's coming to some consensus. But the things you would have to think about is what might be the level and duration of any disruption of your ability to serve clients, what might be the potential legal liability, what might be the financial impact, but what would be the severity of the impact? And again, this could depend on what risk mitigation you currently have in place. So if I think of an example, if I have an executive director who is set to retire within the next 2 years, so the likelihood of loss of a key person is high. I can't do much about that. That's high. The consequences could be a lot of knowledge walks out the door. The consequences could be kind of a loss of some key relationships with donors or funders or others. So you think through the consequences. Now, the impact of that could be very high. But if I'm in an organization that has a succession plan in place, we're already working on ensuring that we are not, we may be double teaming the ED on key relationships with donors and funders. We're ensuring that key pieces of what the ED does are documented so somebody can walk in and do it. Well, if I have that risk mitigation in place, the impact for my organization of losing that key person, which is highly likely, is going to be much lower than if I'm in an organization that's going to lose the ED and I have no succession plan, I have poor documentation of processes, the ED has a lot of the critical relationships that the organization depends on, then the impact could be very high. So again, this is very dependent on thinking about your organization and what you have in place when you think about impact. So do we have, if you can put up poll 3, Triana, and I'll look here to see if there are any questions kind of about how you analyze risk. So the question is, the impact of a risk rating tells me the consequences for the organization. True or false? And I don't see any questions here. I've either lost you all or this is just making perfect sense to everyone. I'm not sure which. But I'll stop for questions again. So I would say that this is false. The consequences tell me what would happen. The impact tells me how large of an impact would that be on the organization. So they're really two different things. The consequences kind of spell out what the consequences would be. The impact tells me how severe would that be? How severely would it disrupt operations? How severely would it impact the organization? So you can close the poll now, Serena. Thanks for those who played along. I don't see any questions here, so I'm just going to carry on. And Janet, this next part is where we're going to get to the matrix for you. So now I get to step 3. So I've identified my risks. I have looked at the likelihood and the consequences, the impact. So I've analyzed the risk. Now I've got to make some decisions. How do I manage that risk? And there are really only 4 ways to manage risk. And how you manage it, you need to think about the position your organization is in. Every organization has a different appetite for risk. It is in a different position in terms of what risks it can and can't undertake. If I have a very healthy reserve fund, I might undertake certain risks that I wouldn't. Maybe at this time where funding's a little iffy going forward, we used up a lot of the reserve fund for COVID. I'm coping with all the risks around COVID. I'm kind of don't want to take on additional risk. So you need to kind of think about, the board needs to think about what is its appetite for risk and kind of what is its risk philosophy. Where does it take on risk and where doesn't it take on risk is kind of an important part of this. And you have different risk capacity at different times in your organization. But there are really only 4 ways to deal with it. You either avoid it, so you eliminate the risk. You either decide this program or this project or this contract is too risky, we're not going to do it, so you don't start it. Or if you're doing something that is high risk to the organization and very difficult to mitigate that risk, and you really can't tolerate it, then you would stop doing that activity. So avoiding risk is one way. But as I said before, the objective here is not to avoid risk. We can't all just go home and pull the covers over our head. You're doing important activity in the community. You have a mission you need to achieve, and you're going to take on risk in order to achieve that. So it's not to avoid it, but it's to decide how you manage it. So the second thing you can do is transfer risk. And mostly it's financial risk that you can transfer. So you get insurance. So if you have a fire, you recover, you don't take the financial hit or the full financial hit. Some contracts can transfer risk. So in some ways you can transfer risk, although it's primary financial risk. The third thing you can do is control risk. So you can say, we're going to take this risk, but we're going to put very clear limits, either on how much risk we take or how we take this risk. We're going to put up some guardrails. And that's what boards write policy for. You write policy as a way to control the risks, to say, this is how we're going to do it. This is the controls we're going to put around this so that we limit our risk. ED limits is another way of doing that. Ongoing reporting from staff to the board can give boards a way to control risk. And the fourth way is to manage the risk, is to accept the risk. We're taking this risk on and we're just going to manage it. And often the way you manage it is by saying, designing processes. So we're going to do it this way all the time. That'll kind of help us manage that risk. It is staff training. It says this is how we manage that risk. And it's kind of monitoring things to make sure those risks you're just accepting as part of doing business are managed appropriately. So those are really only the 4 decisions that you have around risk. Let's go. Whoops, I went backwards. So here's, and Janet, I don't know if this is what you meant by the matrix, but this is a way to think about risks in your organization. And as I said, most boards see risk in a very piecemeal basis. And this is a way to think about what the risks are in your organization and how you are managing those risks and whether or not you're mitigating those risks appropriately. So on the horizontal axis, I have impact from low to high, and on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, I have likelihood from low to high. So if risk mitigation is often about either lowering the likelihood something is going to happen or lowering the impact if it does happen. So if I have a risk that I think is highly likely to happen and is going to have a highly negative impact on the organization, that puts me up in that top right corner, the board needs to step in. The board needs to step in and make sure something is done that either lowers the likelihood it's going to happen or lowers the impact if it does happen. It's not tolerable, particularly for a nonprofit corporation, to take on risks where bad things are highly likely to happen and have a highly negative impact on the organization. And so in that case, you need to look at policy, you need to look at controls. In some cases, you may need to look at avoiding it to stop doing some activity. But that's how to think about, you don't want risks up in that top right quadrant. If it is something that is not likely to happen, fairly low impact. You just accept that risk and monitor it to make sure the impact or the likelihood doesn't change much on you. If it's highly likely to happen but very low impact, tends to be where we develop processes that would lower the likelihood something goes wrong. We monitor those things. If it's not likely to happen, but if it did, would have a highly negative impact on the organization, you want to make sure that you've got some contingency plan in place for that. And I'll talk a bit later. Often with smaller organizations, that's having kind of a generic crisis management plan. But that's where you want to make sure that you're monitoring that to make sure the likelihood stays low. And you want to make sure that if it does happen, you've got a contingency plan in place. So for instance, after SARS, anybody who was funded through health had to have a pandemic plan. Now, I haven't gone back to those people to see how well those worked when COVID hit, but so it was, a pandemic is low likelihood, but high impact. So you had to have a contingency plan. So that's kind of the matrix that I would use in thinking about both the likelihood something would happen, the impact if it does, and what's the appropriate organizational response to that. So so that's step 3. Are there any questions about this matrix or about, this decision making, how to make decisions around risk? I'll just take a look at the chat box here. Nope, I don't see any. And Janet said that answered her question, so that's good. So we'll just go on. So now I've got all this stuff, okay? I've identified my risks. I've got likelihood rating, impact rating. I've got consequences. How do I pull all this together and kind of see this picture and know whether I'm making rational decisions around this? And how the way the board, a good way for the board to do this, and what I would recommend, is that the organization have a risk management framework that is updated and reviewed regularly. And we're going to talk through that framework. I'm going to give you examples of it. But there are many formats for that would work. You'll see the format that I'm using. But you need a couple of key pieces of information. You need to have the risk identified. You need your likelihood and impact ratings. You need to know the consequence. And you need to know how it is managed or mitigated in the organization today. And then the board has to ask itself, has anything changed? And is the board satisfied with the way the risks are being managed or mitigated? So it's the way the board can kind of pull this together in a very intentional, systematic way, look at the risks as a whole, rather than just kind of dealing with things as they happen to come up. So I'm going to go through and we'll look at, this is to me what a risk management framework would look like. So over on the left, this first column here, I've got my buckets. So I've got financial, and then I've listed out, here are the risks I've identified. Got another bucket called legal. These are the risks I've identified. I have a column for the likelihood rating that this risk is going to happen. I have a column for the impact rating if it does happen. I have a column that kind of spells out the consequences. And I have a column that says, here's how we currently mitigate this today. And I'll go through a couple examples of this. Now, some organizations might add another column, which would say, here's who's responsible for managing the risk. Some might add another column that at the time of review would be where they could capture, these are the additional steps we need to take around this risk. So kind of not an action plan, but these are the actions we need to take. So you can play with the framework, but these are kind of the critical pieces of information that you need. So here's my first example. So I've got the risk of fraud. I think the likelihood is low because we do an annual audit. I have financial management policies in place that are robust, that have been reviewed recently. The finance committee provides good oversight. And given the kinds of transactions I do, I think the risk of fraud is low. The consequences would be a loss of funds, possible reputational hit, could be others. So it could have high impact. So low likelihood, high impact. Then the board has to ask the question, am I satisfied with that? Am I satisfied with the way it's mitigated today? Very important that what goes in this last column is what you are actually doing today. I have seen people do these and kind of put in theoretically what they think should be in place, even though they don't have them in place. So mitigation is what you are doing and what is in place today. Here's another example we talked about. I have an HR bucket. One of the risks I've identified is the loss of a key person. I think it's a medium risk. My ED is not set to retire within the next 2 years. I don't think I'm going to lose my key finance person or my key operations person. If I did, it would have a negative impact on operations. I would have a loss of knowledge, potential loss of revenue. But I've got succession plans in place for all key positions, and all of my key processes are documented. So I think I'm in pretty good shape. And I've decided that likelihood is medium and that impact is medium. And so the question I need to ask, is there anything else I should be doing here to mitigate this risk? Or am I satisfied with the way this risk is being mitigated? Here's another example.
We have some questions. We have some question on chat room.
I'm going to stop in just a second after this framework and take the questions, okay? So the failure to protect privacy rights would be a risk. I've rated the likelihood as low. I've got good records processes in place. I've got good security protocols in place. However, if it did happen, it would have a high impact given the kind of client data I have, given the kind of regulation that's out there. So the consequence could be an inappropriate or illegal disclosure of information. I could be open to potential legal liability. So I've said the likelihood is low, but the impact could be high. Again, those are judgment calls. The last one, operational risk, theft of property. I've got insurance against any major losses, so I have transferred that risk, the financial risk, to the insurance company. I have good security policies in place. The consequence would be a temporary loss of operational capacity, maybe. I might have to take some expense to replace it, although most of that risk has been handed off. So I'm going to rate that low likelihood and low impact rating. So let me look at the chat box here. Trent, if you can launch poll number 4, where I'm looking at the chat box. One says, just curious from your work experience, what's the percentage of nonprofit organizations that have risk management framework? So it's becoming more common. It is becoming, boards are becoming more aware of the importance of risk management. Funders are starting to ask questions. Accreditation starts to ask questions about risk management. So I think people are becoming more aware of it and more attention is being paid. I'm certainly working with more people around developing risk management frameworks maybe than we did before. So I don't have any survey or anything I can point to. Another question, would you agree all risks, even if non-financial, has a financial impact? I would have to think about that. But you could be right. The cost, there may be some cost to me in any given risk. If I had a minute to think about it, my guess is I could come up with some risks that maybe had a reputational impact, but not a financial impact. Although if I took a hit on the reputation, I might take a hit on donations. So it would indirectly have a financial impact. It may not be a direct impact, but it could be an indirect impact. Let's see what else we have here. Curious to learn about the organizations that implemented health risk management post-SARS. How often do they revisit? Did organizations with SARS risk management put their plans aside, or were they well ahead? And I don't have an answer to that. As I said, I haven't gone back. I have a fair number of clients that had to prepare those, but I haven't gone back to them to actually say how well did those pandemic plans that were put together after SARS help you kind of navigate COVID. So I don't have an answer to that. Another one here that says, do your ratings of likelihood and impact reflect the situation after mitigation or without mitigation? They reflect the situation with the mitigation that you have in place today. So not the mitigation you think you should have, not the mitigation you wish you should have, but looking at what mitigation you have in place today, then that would impact your likelihood and impact ratings. Last questions. There are times when a high negative impact also comes with a high positive impact. A difficult risk assessment, i.e. dismissing a long-term employee who is highly respected externally but problematic internally. Reputation versus team innovation. That's true. And that's critical to really understand the risk. And are you prepared? It comes back to risk appetite, risk capacity. In some cases, you might make a decision, you're just prepared to live with that risk. In other cases, that risk is going to be intolerable and have a negative impact on the organization that you can't tolerate, regardless of what might be good about it. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, but I will agree with you at times. Mitigating risk can seem to be something that slows you down or that has a negative impact, but you have to think about the risk and the risk that you're actually taking. Somebody responded, said they could see indirect impact financially of non-financial risks. Funders could discontinue granting to an organization if, say, the organization has an unhealthy work environment, and those receiving support from the organization. So yeah, reputational risks do in the end could have a significant financial impact. So you're right that there could be direct or indirect financial impacts. On the poll, we said, I need to know how risk is mitigated before I can decide how severe the impact is. And that's true, because the impact will depend on what mitigation I currently have in place. So Tran, I think you can end that poll now. Thanks. And I think I've dealt with the questions. So we'll go on to the next section. So let's talk about the role of the board in risk management. So first of all, the role of the board is to lead by demonstrating good governance and effective oversight. If the board itself is not operating in line with kind of best practices around governance. It sets a very bad example and kind of a bad tone for the organization around risk management. Key decisions around risk are generally board decisions, whether or not the organization will take on a certain risk. Certainly most boards, when it comes to expensing over a certain amount of money, requires some kind of board approval. So key decisions around how much risk the organization is going to take on and how it will be mitigated are board decisions. Strategic planning is an interesting one to think about, because strategic planning is a way of addressing many of the strategic risks in the organization. You develop a strategic plan in order to kind of take advantage of the strategic opportunities and address the strategic threats. So strategic planning is also kind of part of the role of the board in risk management. Are they looking at the strategic threats, and does their strategic plan address that? The board's role would be to review the risk management framework regularly, kind of satisfy themselves that they understand the risks in the organization and that they are satisfied that those risks are appropriately mitigated. It's to ensure policies are developed and implemented, ensure appropriate mitigation is implemented, and assure crisis management is in place and works. And I think this is really critical for boards, because there are risks, you really can't foresee them, but something could happen that would have an immediate negative impact on the organization that requires immediate action. And what you need is a generic kind of crisis management plan. Who are the 5 people who have to be around the table? How do I get hold of them? Who are their backups? And very clear decision-making roles, and very clear internal and external communication roles, so that no matter kind of what happens, I've got that kind of crisis management plan that I can quickly pull that group together, make some decisions, and the roles are clear about how to go forward. I think that's very important around risk management when it comes to boards. Management. So what's the role of management around risk management? First of all, the role of the management team is to lead by example. That they understand the risks in the organization, they are paying attention to them, they are following policy and procedure. So a lot of it is leading by example. Flagging risks for the board is an important role of management. Promoting a risk management culture within the organization. Generally, the staff would develop the risk management framework. They would be managing and monitoring the risks. They would develop and implement mitigation for many risks. And they would ensure that all board policies are implemented and followed. So that's kind of the role of management around risks. I want to, so I'm going to give you some resources, and then I'm going to talk about kind of some final thoughts around this. These are some resources that are useful for thinking about risk management. Whoops. If you haven't, Chartered Public Accountants Canada, CPA Canada, if you're not familiar with their 20 questions booklets, they're very useful resources. They're free, downloadable. You know, they have 20 questions directors should ask about marketing, 20 questions directors should ask about fundraising, 20 questions directors should ask about whatever. And they do have 20 questions directors should ask about risk management. Imagine Canada has some good resources. Bloomberg's and Carter's are 2 law firms that publish some free resources that can be useful to stimulate your thinking about, particularly around compliance and legal risks. When you download this presentation, you can just click on those links. And and kind of see. Can you launch poll 5 for me, Tarana? So it's the role of management to ensure that policies are implemented and followed. This is kind of a gimme, I'm hoping. And I'll just take a look at the chat box. I don't see any questions here. So let me just see. Whoops. So, okay, we got 11 people to play along there, and it is true. One of the key roles of management is to ensure that board policies are implemented and that they are followed. So you can end that poll. Thanks, Trana. So I want to kind of talk about some final thoughts around this that again, I think are important. When we think about risk management, again, the issue is not to avoid risk. You are doing important things. You have a mission that you are passionate about, that you need to achieve. You will take on risks in order to do that. So it's not about not taking on risk. It's about understanding the risks we have taken on and understanding and kind of ensuring that we are managing those risks and that those risks kind of collectively are within the risk appetite and capacity of the organization. So all organizations need to have risk management in place. It is a key governance function. If you are a very small organization, you should still have a risk management framework. Mass is a very low risk organization given the type of organization that we are and the activities we undertake. I think probably about 10 years ago, I did the first risk management framework for Mass. It was fairly simple, but the board looks at it every year. There are critical risks that we need to look at. Can we recruit enough volunteers, those kinds of things. So even very low risk organizations and small organizations should have a risk management framework. Remember that risk management is often about common sense and good planning. It is not something, that is rocket science. It's about identify the risk, use your common sense and good planning, and that will often help you. Remember that it is everyone's job. Risk management is not only the role of the board, it's not only the role of management, it's also the role of all of your employees or volunteers. Everybody needs to play their part. And the last thing that I would say is start the journey. And if you don't have a risk management framework, don't decide that by the end of next month you have to have the whole thing done and polished. Take on one bucket, take on 2 buckets, think through the risks, think this through. So start the journey. It's not going to be perfect the first time. You'll get better at it each time you review the framework, each time you think through the risks. You'll get better at understanding the risks, being clearer about what the risk is, being clearer about what the consequences are. I would encourage you to start, but not overwhelm yourself by deciding everything has to be done tomorrow. So before I go to the final slides, somebody has said, could I show the management slide again? Yes, there it is. They didn't ask a question about it. They just asked me to show it. So I have shown it. I will go back. I don't see any more questions here. Let me just go through to make sure I've answered them all. So Okay, here's one. What are your thoughts around involving staff in this process? Personally, I think it's important, though I'm curious, do you have some examples of where you've seen this done well? It is critical that you involve staff in this process, would be my answer. Now, it depends on what bucket of risk you're talking about. If you're talking about some compliance issues and the risk that you're not operating by bylaws, that can largely be done by a board committee. So staff, but any kind of operational risk, most risks, IT risks would all be developed by staff. It's staff who understand how operations work, understand the risks, and need to think it through. In terms of some examples of where I've seen this done well, I've seen a number of organizations do it well, and they did put together, they didn't try and do the whole thing at once. And they put together, maybe one group that looked at this bucket and another group that looked at this bucket. And then they learned from that experience before they went on to other buckets. So it's probably what I have seen work best is a person driving it. And I would suggest it is driven by the executive director, maybe with one or two board members that they can deal with on it, and the people that it would be kind of a revolving set of people depending on the set of risks you're dealing with that are involved in defining the risk, defining the consequence, and the ratings, and understanding how it's currently mitigated would be revolving depending on what bucket you're in. You would need your finance people around the finance risk. You're talking about HR, you need your HR people. So it may change a bit. Do you have a recommendation for how often the board should review and update their risk management framework? I would say annually. I would say that once you have it, once the board has initially looked at it, I would say that annually the board should review it. Now, of course, on an ongoing basis, remember that one of the obligations or the role of management is to flag risks for the board. So there may be new risks or some change in likelihood or impact around a risk that needs to be flagged for the board in between that. But as a basic review of the framework, I would say annually. Another question here. Are you going to talk about how to balance risk management and cost of it? I wasn't. I would address that by saying, understand the costs of not addressing risk management. They may be hidden to you now, but there can be really severe costs to not having sufficient risk mitigation in place. So yes, it may cost you something to put a critical control in place, but without that control, the cost could be much higher. So in thinking about how you mitigate risk, yes, there's kind of a cost benefit analysis, but you need to keep in mind the cost, the potential cost if that goes bad to the organization. Does that answer that question from RYL? Maybe you can let me know. There's once that I said Jane when I meant Janet. I'm not sure where that comes from. Oh, that was a response to the question from Janet. RYL, did I answer that question appropriately, or maybe you can tell me if, okay, so they're okay with that response. Any other questions? So before I go to the last slide, Tarana is going to put a SurveyMonkey link in the chat. I would ask that everyone click on that link before we end the session and do a quick SurveyMonkey evaluation of this webinar. before we finish it. So if you can just put it, Tran, if you want to put it, there's the link to, is that the SurveyMonkey link, Tarana?
Yes, it is. I should probably,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so if you can just click on that link, www.research.net, it'll take you to the SurveyMonkey, a fast survey. You can do that while we're finishing up the presentation. The other link that she's going to put in here is a link for the learning session on Monday. So Monday afternoon, I'll be available. There will be another session where we can have some more discussion around risk management, around some of the issues that were raised today. And I'll be available. It'll be facilitated by Okazi. If you're interested, you can sign up for that on that link for Eventbrite. And as long as a couple of people sign up, we'll have that learning exchange Monday afternoon. So those are the two links. So as we go to finish this off, I think I've answered all the questions that were raised. I don't see any additional questions. So I just want to say thank you for your attention, your time. I think this is an important issue. I hope the presentation will be of use to your organization. This is the contact information for MAS. If you want to get, probably the best way to get in touch with us is through our email address. You can always go to our website and look at the kinds of services that we provide. We do free consulting in, HR, fundraising, strategic planning, finance, lots of different management consulting areas. We have practices, and you can go in and look at the descriptions of those practices and what they do. And we're always happy to do things like this for individual organizations. So with that, Tarana, I guess I will hand it back to you.